All right, here we go with our Unit 4 video lecture reviewing the early modern era that goes from 1450 to 1750. We have 4 parts. We have 2 parts dedicated to the global networks, and then the other parts dedicated to numbers 2 and 3 that you see on your screen. Those 2 and 3. All right, global network. So the big change we see during this time period is the shift of global trade networks, right? And we see the creation of 2 new global trade networks. And we call these global because they include the Americas, right? So you might have had long distance and intra-regional trade before, or trans-regional trade. We never had global. Now, the first or the main new trade network, of course, is the triangle trade that we see in the Atlantic Ocean between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But there's also the trans Pacific trade where the Americas and Asia is trading, and Europe is kind of in between those two. Now, as global trade shifts to maritime and shifts to the Atlantic and Pacific, we see that there's going to be a weakening in the volume of trade in other trade networks, especially the land trade routes, right? Like the Silk Road and the Trans-Sahara Trade Network. These two are going to reduce and diminish and get less and less and less important. Um, because again, the Europeans are shifting the focus of trade to be maritime. Now, the Mediterranean trade network, which has been around since forever, it's still up and running, but it's going to have less and less of an importance. We also see that the Indian Ocean, even though that's still continuing, is going to have less participation from different countries or different people because the Europeans are going to slowly start to dominate that trade network. So as Europe starts to dominate trade around the world, we see that this is the time of the rise of the West. That means that maritime empires like the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French and the British, they're going to have these huge empires with colonies spanning the globe and all this wealth coming in because they are slowly dominating trade. At the same time this is happening, we see that the older, more traditional land empires are going to start to decline, especially by the 1750s, towards the end of this time period. We see, for example, in West Africa, the Songhai Empire is going to decline. We see that the Ottomans are going to slowly weaken as there's less trade and less money coming in, whether it's the Mediterranean trade or the Silk Road. We see that the Italian city-states, right, who are the richest cities in Europe during the Renaissance, right, in the 1400s, by the 1700s, the Italian city-states are super poor, right, because again, there's less trade going through the Mediterranean. We see that the Persians are going to trade less, the Indians are going to trade less, the Chinese are going to trade less, and there's going to be more like letting other people trade on their behalf. Especially in the Indian Ocean, we see the Ming Chinese that they completely cut off from trading with the Indian Ocean. The Mughal Indian Empire is also going to become dependent on Europe to trade, and that allows Europeans to expand their dominance. Now, how did the Europeans get to this position in the first place? Well, they benefited right from the cultural diffusion of the post-classical era. Right, we see how through Spanish Islam, Muslim Spain, I mean, we see how technology and knowledge spread from the China, from the Indians, from the Islamic world, and slowly made its way into Europe by 1400s or so. And we also see the Renaissance take place at this time. So the Europeans are looking back at their Greek and Roman, the classical empires. They're looking at the Islamic advancements and the Asian advancements, and they're going to combine and they're going to diffuse all this knowledge, all this technology, all these maritime navigational tools that came elsewhere. They're going to combine them all together to create the caravel, right? The elite ship of Europe in the 1400s, right? This is the type of ship that Columbus would have sailed. And using the caravel and using better understanding of global wind and ocean currents, we see that the Europeans are going to, go further and further and further across the oceans. Now, of course, the Europeans weren't the only ones exploring during this time period. We can, neglect to talk about Zheng He, right, who was the famous Chinese Muslim admiral who goes on throughout the Indian Ocean, not necessarily to explore, but to collect tribute and to display China's wealth and power and prosperity. And he has, hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors going with him, showing off how big and bad Ming China truly was. And of course, these ships, these explorations come to an end. These voyages come to an end when the Confucian upper class, the Confucian scholar gentry says, the rest of the world has nothing to offer, and we have, we better use our resources to more immediate problems like the pesky Mongols on the other side of the Great Wall. So Zheng He, again, remember the Europeans are not the only ones exploring. Zheng He is out there as well. Now, when it comes to Europe, we see that the kind of the first leading country is going to be Portugal. Portugal is trying to find that direct trade to India. They're going to slowly make their way there, thanks a lot to the work of Prince Henry the Navigator, who funds a lot of these explorations and funds the school for navigation. So the Europeans are, putting out this knowledge to good use. The explorers, the first one is Bartholomew Diaz. He's slowly going to make his way down the coast of Africa, right, setting up trading posts wherever his ship would land. And eventually we have, what's his face? Da Gama, Vasco da Gama, who's going to sail from Portugal all the way to India, right, sailing across the southern tip of Africa, making his way to India and coming back home a rich guy. So the Portuguese lead the way. The Spanish are going to follow. They're going to, the monarchs are going to sponsor. They're going to pay for Columbus's voyages, which eventually, of course, leads to the discovery of the New World. But they also, paid for other voyages like Magellan. Magellan is the one who circumnavigates or goes around the Earth, and then he also discovers the Philippines and claims that the Philippines belong to Spain, which, of course, eventually it becomes a colony. So here we see some of these navigators, some of these supporters of navigation. So how did the Europeans grow in power and wealth? Is because they take on the role of the middlemen, meaning that as the major Asian countries, China, Japan, India, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavids, right, as these empires kind of like seclude themselves a little bit more and more and more, right, they're less willing to go out to trade. So instead of going out to trade, they would just trade with whoever happens to show up in one of their ports, one of their on their coastline. And of course, these would be the Europeans who show up. So the Europeans will start trading, sending goods from one Asian country to another Asian country. So this tells us that the Europeans really didn't have much to offer, with few exceptions here and there. Especially compared to like Africa, where the Europeans are giving a lot of manufactured goods to Africa, and Africa is, trading along the triangle trade. But in Asia, the Europeans are more like the middlemen, right? So the Chinese have stuff that the Japanese want, and the Japanese have stuff that the Chinese want, but neither one is going to send the ship to go across to trade. So therefore, we see Europeans show up and say, "We'll do that for you." And of course, they're going to hike up the prices whenever they do this transfer. So the British are going to do the same thing, the Dutch are going to do the same thing, and little by little, maritime trade becomes dominated by Europeans. At the same time, that land-based trade becomes less and less frequent. Now, all of this, of course, is kind of like this massive, increase of global trade is kind of like inspired by silver, right? Silver that is being pumped out of South America, out of Potosi in South America, right? And this silver currency, the pesos de ocho that you see right here in this picture, right? The pesos de ocho, they're going to be found all over the world. Right, so the Spanish are going to take this to the Philippines, and from there they're going to take it to China. They're going to buy a whole bunch of stuff from the Chinese. They're going to buy stuff from India, and this is going to become a global currency, right? It is accepted worldwide. The problem, of course, is that when you have so much silver, and they keep pumping it out and pumping it out and pumping it out, and the Chinese keep buying and buying and buying and gaining more silver. The negative side is that you have inflation, where you have so much silver that it will eventually destabilize the Chinese economy, the Ming economy, and the Spanish economy as well, because again, they're going to have so much silver that all the prices are going to go up since silver is overly abundant. So silver plays that critical role in the global circulation of of trade, right, of these trade goods. Now, of course, besides the introduction of silver as a global currency, we see that mercantilism plays a major role as well. Remember, mercantilism is that economic theory saying that a country, a state needs to have direct control over what stuff is coming in the country, what imports are coming in, and what exports are going out. Right? You want to maximize your exports and minimize your imports. You want to have as much gold and silver as possible. The more gold, the more silver, the more powerful you are. And in order to accomplish this, we see the creation of joint stock companies. And this is stuff, especially with the British and the Dutch, where a private company that is funded by private investors goes out to try to make a profit. And if that company is successful, then all the people who share uh, a um, a stock, right, a percentage of the ownership of the company will gain and become richer. And if that company happens to fail, then you lose your investments, but at least you're not completely bankrupt. So joint stock companies becomes a new business model, right? A new method to invest and to gain money. And the two most successful joint stock companies, of course, are the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, which is normally abbreviated as the VOC. And you see their symbol there. This is, of course, the British East India Company. And of course, along with the creation of these joint stock companies, we see that the creation of bank houses or stock exchange, like you would see nowadays in Wall Street up in New York City, right? So with the creation of the expansion of joint stock companies, we see more and more Europeans are going to grow wealthier with all this trade, with all these explorations. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about for part one is the triangle trade. Where the triangle trade is the dominant, the most important trade network of this time period, and is going to lead to the Columbian Exchange. That means all the stuff, all the animals and plants and people and diseases and culture from the old world is going to make its way to the new world and vice versa, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. The negative side, or one of the negative sides of this, is of course that the native populations of the Americas are going to die from all these diseases that they're not known for, and therefore, right, kind of an effect of an effect, we see the creation of the transatlantic slave trade because those Africans are going to be brought in, African slaves are going to be brought in to replace the natives who are dying. So the triangle trade network is the cause, right, of the Columbian Exchange and the transatlantic slave trade. All right, so that is it for part number one. Hopefully that was fast enough, even for you, Marcos, even for you.